The mess hall at FOB Bastion felt thick and stifling, heavy with the scent of burned coffee and grit that seemed to coat your lungs. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, barely moving the hot air while metal trays clanged and radios crackled with bursts of noise from the corner. At a table off to the side, a young corporal bent over a damaged field radio, her fingers working carefully as she adjusted a screw, her dark hair falling forward like a curtain blocking out the stairs. "Check her out," a Marine said just loud enough for his buddies to hear, wearing a smug grin. "She can patch a wire, but what good is that in a war?" Chuckles rolled through the group, mixed with the clatter of utensils, designed to cut deep. She never reacted, never glanced up. Her attention stayed fixed on that broken radio like nothing else in the world existed. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button for military and veteran stories so you catch every real story of bravery, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from right now. Corporal Sarah Whitaker was 27, though the creases near her eyes sometimes aged her. Afghanistan had a talent for stealing youth and adding silence. She wasn't someone who commanded a room the second she entered. Average height, lean frame, skin tanned darker by relentless sun, dark brown hair typically pulled back and hid. If it weren't for the thin scar tracing her wrist, a pale line against her skin, most people would forget she was even there. She worked as a 25U, a signal support specialist. In simpler terms, she kept radios working, computers running, and made sure communication didn't collapse when everything went sideways. To the infantry guys, she was just the cable tech. To the special operations teams rotating through FOB Bastion, she was that person hunched in the command tent corner, surrounded by tangled wires and white noise. Necessary, sure, respected, not even close. They figured real combat belonged to the ones breaking down doors, not the ones tightening connections in silence. Sarah had heard every cheap shot imaginable. She's the one who babysits the radios, good with gadgets, useless with guns. The comments rolled off her back, but the hurt lingered because hidden behind those calm eyes was something she never brought up in casual talk. Something that had earned her far more than the right to sit behind equipment. But those kinds of secrets didn't need announcing, not yet. Her habit was straightforward but revealing. A well-worn screwdriver always rested in her cargo pocket. It wasn't military issue, nothing fancy about it. Her father had owned it, a man who'd spent too many tours in the steaming heat of Vietnam. He'd died years ago, but not before passing along one lesson that stayed with her. The right tool in capable hands can save lives. For him, it meant fixing radios under hostile fire, ensuring his platoon never lost contact. For her, it meant never being without that tool. It connected her to him and to a responsibility few understood. Her father's dog tags stayed tucked in her chest pocket, close enough that she felt them press against her ribs whenever she leaned over a console. Her mother, a schoolteacher back in Fayetteville, had hoped she'd stay home, earn a college degree, maybe even teach like her. But Sarah inherited her father's determination, and when she raised her hand to take the oath, she understood she wasn't there to hide in the background. Yet that's precisely where everyone placed her. Background noise, invisible unless something stopped working. Nobody questioned the scar on her wrist. Nobody wondered why she carried herself with the kind of precision that didn't come from just handling wires for a couple years. And when she crossed the dusty grounds, eyes straight ahead, her posture hinted she'd once done far more than fix radios. Still, nobody bothered to look deeper. The reality was, she never corrected their assumptions. Let them believe whatever they want. The infantry soldiers showed off their strength. The special operators strutted around with their night vision gear and hard-earned reputations. And Sarah? She kept her head down and her screwdriver ready. When she sat by herself in the mess hall staring into a chipped mug of terrible coffee, her thoughts sometimes wandered back to North Carolina. Fayetteville was an army town living in Fort Bragg's shadow, and kids there either escaped the military entirely or had it running through their veins. She belonged to the second group. As a teenager, she'd run laps along the airfield fences, timing herself to the rhythm of morning formation calls drifting across the base. Some of those soldiers returned from deployments with eyes like hers now focused, aged beyond their years. But here at Bastion, surrounded by men who measured respect by volume, she was written off as the quiet tech with wires. No combat tales to tell, no chest covered in medals, just hands that never trembled when she stripped copper and made connections in brutal heat. The twisted truth was Sarah had walked through hell they couldn't fathom. She'd heard mortars whistling close, felt the earth shake beneath her boots, and watched as dead radios meant lives vanishing. She carried those memories like shadows following her everywhere. But to everyone else she was invisible until the power failed, or communications died. She didn't chase their approval, but when the mockery grew too loud, when someone muttered "clerk" under their breath, she'd catch her own reflection in a dusty screen and remind herself of something she already understood. Soldiers aren't measured by who sees them. They're measured by what they accomplish when nobody else can. And Sarah Whitaker was about to prove exactly that. Don't look away. The next part changes the entire story. Days melted together at FOB Bastion, dust working its way into every crack of the base until even the air you breathed felt grainy. Mealtimes offered the only breaks, but even then, Corporal Sarah Whitaker felt the separation as harsh as the desert heat. When she walked through the mess hall carrying her tray, men would shift on benches, gear spread out taking extra room. She learned to pass by without looking, finding a corner spot alone with her coffee and barely warm food. The quiet around her table always felt louder than the noise everywhere else. It wasn't the quiet of honor, it was the quiet of being One afternoon, a sergeant covered in combat patches dropped into a nearby seat, eyeing her with a grin too wide to mean anything good. "Hey, cable tech," he shouted across the space loud enough for his whole squad to laugh. "Got any wires you can fix for us to—" His crew burst out laughing, one of them pretending to plug in an imaginary lamp. Sarah didn't react. She lifted a forkful of food to her mouth, chewing slowly, staring at the scratched tabletop. That nickname clung to her like tar. Cable tech. It trailed her between the rows of tents, whispered like a running joke as she entered the communications room, muttered when she passed soldiers preparing for patrols. Sometimes it came with smirks, sometimes just with eyes rolling her direction. Each time she stayed quiet, moving with that same steady rhythm, her screwdriver and radio components rattling softly in her pack. The gossip spread like wildfire. A young private, desperate to impress the louder voices, started a rumor that Sarah only passed training because they'd lowered the bar for women. "She got waved through," he bragged to a group, voice dripping with fake confidence. "She never would have made it if they hadn't gone." That sparked another round of laughter at the smoke pit that evening, men elbowing each other and snickering when she walked by. Sarah caught pieces, soft standards, not real army, base decoration. She kept moving, boots grinding over gravel, posture straight, not a single glance thrown back. By that point, pack mentality had taken hold. It wasn't just one or two soldiers mocking her anymore. It was a current beneath everything, something she could sense even when nobody spoke. At the gym, she noticed eyes flicking toward her, judgment written clearly. In the communications tent, men pulled their chairs closer to each other, pushing her to the margins. The exclusion became more obvious. During a tactical drill for potential base defense, an infantry squad ran through their assignment. Sarah, standing close by with her notepad and headset, stepped forward to suggest incorporating radio checks into the sequence. The squad leader brushed her off with a smirk. "Not your job, cable tech. We've got it covered. Go play with your wire." The laughter that followed cut sharper, digging deeper than any silence. Sarah's response stayed consistent, calm, almost eerily so. She said nothing, just returned to the console she'd been working on. Her hands remained steady as always, the thin scar on her wrist catching light while she tuned frequencies. She wore her composure like protective gear, and the harder they tried to crack it, the stronger it seemed to grow. It bothered them in ways they wouldn't say out loud. There's something disturbing about a soldier who refuses to break when everyone expects her to. She spent long nights bathed in green screen light, fixing cables and tracking communications, her father's screwdriver turning in her grip like a prayer. Outside, laughter echoed from the recreation tents, where others swapped stories about firefights and midnight operations. Inside, Sarah was the invisible force keeping their connections alive while being treated like she didn't belong. Every so often, a few soldiers would hang back, watching her hands work across the equipment. She'd catch their stares before they quickly turned away, almost ashamed to be interested. It was like her silence was starting to pose a question they didn't want confronting. What if cable tech wasn't what they assumed? But the pressure kept building. She got left off patrol assignments, deliberately excluded. She'd find her name erased from chalkboards, listing duty rotation. Even when her unit technically needed a communications specialist attached, someone else would quietly fill the position. She stayed inside the wire, her skills ignored. It affected her in ways she wouldn't acknowledge. Not the mockery itself, she'd endured worse in silent years past, but the rejection of what she carried inside. The refusal to see her beyond the box they'd shoved her into. Each time she walked past a squad heading through the gate, weapons ready and helmets secure, she felt the distance widen. They saw her as invisible, yet she held knowledge that had once meant the difference between survival and death. The irony was crushing, almost vicious. If they only knew. Sarah Whitaker never struck back, never raised her voice, never exploded in frustration. She stayed steady, quiet, screwdriver in her pocket, father's dog tags pressing against her chest. It was like she was waiting for something, or challenging fate to let time vindicate her, and the silence she maintained unsettled them more each day. Because sometimes the strongest response to ridicule is refusing to respond at all. What would you do in her position? Tell me in the comments, salute or no salute. The Afghan sun transformed the communications tent into a furnace by midday. The canvas walls glowed with heat that weighed down every breath. Radios hissed and clicked in broken patterns, voices cutting through static that filled the empty spaces. For most soldiers it was background noise, something to ignore. For Sarah Whitaker it was the only sound she relied on. She sat hunched over a damaged receiver, turning a dial with steady fingers, sweat sliding down her temple. One day, during an extended intercept, a scratchy message in Pashto bled through the static. It was barely audible, the type of fragment most wouldn't bother recording, but Sarah's lips moved almost unconsciously. She whispered a quiet translation under her breath, a single phrase that made a nearby sergeant stop cold. He wasn't certain he'd heard correctly, but the flow of her words was unmistakable. It wasn't the clumsy guessing of someone faking it. It was the fluency of someone who'd listened many times before. The sergeant said nothing, but later that night the story leaked into the smoke. I'm telling you, she spoke Pashto clear as anything. At first the others dismissed it. Another strange thing from cable tech. But the laughter felt thinner this time. Some foreheads wrinkled just enough to plant a seed. Another hint appeared in the most routine way. A private was grabbing tape from Sarah's pack while she knelt rewiring a console. As he reached inside, his fingers touched a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of being opened and closed. He pulled it out thoughtlessly, curiosity winning for half a second, before Sarah's hand shot out and grabbed it back. The look in her eyes was sharp enough to freeze him. He only glimpsed it, a header, formal and bold. Commendation for distinguished service. The rest disappeared before he could process it. He didn't tell anyone directly, but news always found a way through the cracks. Soon, whispers mixed with the usual mockery. What kind of award would a cable clerk even get? No way you're inventing that. I swear I saw it. Something official. The contradiction started eating at them. Even her tattoo drew attention when sleeves rolled up against the merciless heat. Faded ink stretched across her forearm, wings with lightning bolts cutting through them. At first glance, some dismissed it as another cheap tattoo from a local shop, but anyone who'd spent time around combat aviation or joint operations recognized the symbol. They saw pieces of it, even if they didn't want to admit it aloud. The conversation shifted tone. Not full respect, nowhere close, but the edge of mockery softened a bit. Instead of loud jeers, there were sideways glances. Instead of bold laughter, there were murmurs. A handful of soldiers caught themselves watching her work longer than they meant to, curious about how she stayed solid under pressure, how she carried something unspoken in the way she held herself. The tent itself seemed to buzz with tension during those long, sweltering afternoons. The constant hum of equipment, the flicker of monitors, the drone of distant generators outside. It all created a backdrop where every small moment felt magnified. Her whispered translations, the glimpse of a commendation, the partially seen tattoo, they piled on top of each other, like puzzle pieces nobody wanted to assemble because the image didn't fit. Cable tech. Nobody dared ask her straight out. Not yet. Soldiers who could mock freely found themselves holding their tongues when she passed. Even the young private who'd started the rumor about lowered standards felt his confidence shake when he caught her eyes reflected in a screen, steady, unwavering, almost challenging him to speak. He didn't. Sarah noticed the shift, though she showed no sign. Her silence stayed intact, her screwdriver still turning in careful circles, her posture unchanged. But if anyone had been paying close attention, they might have caught the faintest hint of a smile when she slipped her father's screwdriver back into her pocket, as if she already knew the truth was creeping closer. What would you think if you spotted those signs? Stay with me. The next part gets even more powerful. The call came just after sunset when the horizon was nothing but red sand melting into darkness. A convoy had been attacked outside the wire, an ambush on the main supply route. The first report crackled over the net like lightning in a storm. Contact, casualties, multiple vehicles down. Within seconds, the command post erupted into chaos. Radios barking, officers hunched over maps under harsh fluorescent lights. Then the main communications went dead. The hum of machines dropped into silence, the lifeline connecting command to the convoy gone in a single burst of static. Panic swept through the room. A major slammed his fist on the console. Another officer shouted into a dead handset, as if volume alone could bring it back to life. The air grew thick with fear and static, men and women staring at each other with wide eyes. In the center of the chaos, Sarah Whitaker didn't rush. She moved with purpose. Her fingers glided across the panel, disconnecting cables, rerouting lines. Calmly, almost mechanically, she flipped switches most of them didn't know existed. The small scar on her wrist caught light. As she reached, the tattoo on her forearm half visible beneath the sleeve she'd rolled back against the heat. Radio's dead. We've lost them. An officer shouted. Check again, Sarah said quietly. Her voice barely rose above the static, but it carried enough force to make the lieutenant freeze mid-yell. She patched into a backup frequency with a few quick turns of her screwdriver, rerouting power from a secondary unit. The hiss of static cleared, and suddenly the convoy was back. Broken voices calling in casualty reports. Sarah adjusted the gain until the words sharpened, then picked up the headset and handed it to the nearest officer. They're back online, so the major stared at her a second too long before snatching it, barking orders down the line with renewed intensity. But Sarah wasn't done. Her headset hissed with background chatter, enemy voices bleeding through a captured frequency. She tilted her head, brow creased, muttering under her breath in a rhythm too precise to be random. It was Pashto, pulled from memory and translated in real time. They're flanking from the ridge, she said suddenly, eyes snapping up. They're moving east, trying to cut off reinforcement. The room froze. For a moment, every pair of eyes locked on her. The clerks, the lieutenants, the NCOs who'd called her cable tech, the sergeant who'd laughed in her face. They all went silent, the weight of her words hitting heavier than the stat. An officer scrambled for the map, tracing the route east. She's right. If they push from that ridge, the convoy's trapped. Orders changed in seconds. Reinforcements redirected. Medical evacuation helicopters rerouted. Lives hung on those words, and Sarah delivered them as casually as if she were reading the time. When it was done, when the frequencies were stable again, and the map lit with new markers, Sarah leaned back from the console. Her hands were steady, her face calm. The storm inside the command post had broken, but she hadn't moved like anyone else. She wiped her palms on her trousers, reached for her screwdriver, and muttered almost to herself, "Just doing my job." The silence that followed was different this time. Not mocking, not dismissive. It was sharp, uneasy. The kind of silence that asks a question without voicing it. Who is she really? And then the answer walked into the room. A Navy SEAL captain, dust still covering his boots, pushed through the entrance with the authority of someone who'd lived too many years in combat. He scanned the chaos, eyes moving past lieutenants and majors until they landed on Sarah. His gaze dropped to her forearm, the tattoo half visible, lightning bolts crossed with wings. The rune seemed to hold its breath. He stepped forward, voice low but cutting through the tension like a knife. "My God, Whitaker." The sound of her name from his mouth was different than the way the others said it. Not mockery, recognition. He turned, his eyes sweeping across the room of frozen soldiers. "You're looking at the reason half my team is still alive." The ripple of shock spread faster than laughter ever had. Soldiers who had smirked, who had pushed her aside in the mess hall, stood frozen as the SEAL captain's words sank in. Years ago, during an operation buried under sand and silence, Sarah Whitaker hadn't been a cable clerk. She'd been the forward air controller attached to a joint task force pinned under rocket fire in the Helmand corridor. Radios had been destroyed. Chaos surrounded them, but her voice had cut through the static, calling in airstrikes with precision that pulled 2 SEAL platoons out alive. That was her past, a past she'd never mentioned, a past written only in folded commendations tucked deep in her pack. And now it was no longer hidden. The captain straightened, his eyes hard with memory. Then he did what nobody in that room expected. He snapped to attention, spine rigid, and raised his hand in a salute. The entire command post froze. The weight of it crushed every laugh, silenced every whisper. Marines who'd once called her cable tech found their throats dry, their eyes lowered, because when a SEAL captain salutes, it isn't just a gesture. It's a judgment. Sarah didn't move for a moment. Then she returned the salute. Slow, steady, eyes locked forward. And in that silence, respect filled the space where mockery had once lived. Don't look away. The next section changes everything. The entrance of the command post tent lifted, and a wave of cooler night air followed the man who stepped through. Dust marked his boot. His uniform displayed the subdued trident patch, and his presence carried the kind of weight that made conversations stop mid-sentence. A Navy SEAL captain, leader of the Joint Task Force, had returned from the edge of the perimeter. His eyes swept across the crowded room, passing over lieutenants with maps and majors clutching radios. He moved like someone who'd seen panic before, and knew how to cut through it. But then his gaze landed on her. Sarah was leaning over the console, adjusting a dial. The rolled sleeve of her uniform pulled back enough to reveal the faded tattoo on her forearm. Wings split by lightning bolts. It was old, worn, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood. His step faltered, his brow furrowed, and then he spoke. "My God, that's Whitaker." The room froze. Officers turned their heads, brows knitting as if they'd misheard. The SEAL captain stepped closer, his voice sharper now. "Stand down. Everyone stand down." The silence that followed was thick. The same men who'd laughed at her hours before suddenly looked between her and the captain, waiting for something none of them grasped. He locked eyes with Sarah. "You're still hiding in communications. After Helmand, after Operation Red Sand." A ripple went through the room at the name. Red Sand was legend among those who'd served in the early 2010s. A joint task force cut off in the Helmand corridor, under siege by coordinated rocket fire and machine gun positions. 2 SEAL platoons trapped in a valley with no clear escape. Radios failing, chaos erupting. The kind of fight most didn't survive, but they had survived because of her. The captain's voice dropped lower, almost reverent. She was the air controller on the ground, 4 hours under fire, holding the network together when everyone else went down. Her communications were the lifeline. Without her, you wouldn't even know the names of half my men because they'd be carved on a wall back home. The color drained from the faces around her. Sarah Whitaker, the cable tech they mocked, the clerk they excluded, had once held the line when entire platoons of SEALs had been moments from destruction. She hadn't just repaired radios. She had been the voice that pulled steel from the sky and kept hope alive until extraction was possible. Operation Red Sand. 4 hours in a firefight that became a survival story, whispered across units, never fully told, but never forgotten by those who owed their lives to it. And at the heart of it, Whitaker, the SEAL captain, straightened his posture, boots clicking against the floor as he came to a halt in front of her. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on hers. Then, in one motion that shattered every whisper in the room, he raised his hand to his brow in a salute. The air stopped moving. Generators hummed outside. Radios clicked. But inside the command post it was as if the world held its breath. A salute from a SEAL captain wasn't casual, wasn't courtesy, it was respect of the highest kind. The soldiers who'd laughed at her name, who'd stolen seats from her table, stood motionless. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared move. Sarah hesitated, eyes steady, her scar catching the glow of the console light. Slowly, deliberately, she returned the salute, and in that silence, the weight of truth finally settled. Sarah Whitaker was no cable clerk. She was the reason legends live to see another day. Stay with me. The next part will give you chills. The command post was frozen in a silence, so heavy it pressed down on every chest. The SEAL captain's salute still hung in the air, his hand raised in sharp precision, his words echoing like thunder through the stunned tent. Without her, half of us wouldn't be alive today. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The truth in his voice carried farther than any volume could have. For the first time since she'd arrived at Bastion, the Marines and soldiers who'd mocked her shifted uncomfortably in their boots. The sergeant who'd laughed the loudest found his jaw clenching, eyes fixed on the floor, as if the ground itself might swallow his shame. The young private who'd spread rumors swallowed hard, his throat working, wishing he could pull every word back into his mouth. They stood straighter now, almost at attention, but not from pride, from guilt. The room, moments ago a hive of panic and noise, was the only sounds were the hiss of radio static and the restless desert wind pressing against the canvas walls. Dust filtered through gaps, curling in thin beams of fluorescent light. And in that charged stillness, men exchanged glances, brief, sharp, full of understanding. They had laughed at her, laughed at a woman who'd once held an entire valley together with nothing but her voice, her training and her determination to keep others alive. They'd pushed her aside, called her cable tech, treated her as less than one of them. And now, faced with the truth, not a single one of them could meet her eyes. Sarah Whitaker didn't bask in the moment. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't throw their words back at them. She stood as she always had, steady, calm, the scar on her wrist catching the light, the tattoo on her arm exposed for all to see. Her father's screwdriver rested lightly in her pocket, a reminder of the man who'd taught her that tools in capable hands could save lives. The SEAL captain lowered his salute slowly, his gaze still locked on her. He turned his head, scanning the room, his words heavy with finality. This woman saved 2 platoons in Helmand, when the world thought we were already dead. You owe her more than your laughter. You owe her your respect. The words hit like rounds in the chest. Soldiers who'd once chuckled at her presence now shifted awkwardly, hands curling into fists at their sides. A few straightened their backs, as if standing taller could somehow erase the way they'd looked at her before. The captain didn't linger. He'd said enough, and his judgment was final. He stepped back, leaving the space between them, charged with a reverence nobody could ignore. Sarah raised her hand at last, returning the salute, but she did it quietly, humbly, her movements slow and deliberate. There was no flourish, no pride etched across her face, only calm recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the respect being given, and the years it had taken for the truth to come to light. The command post seemed to hold its breath. Men who'd once mocked her now looked down, the weight of their shame louder than any insult they'd spoken. Others looked at her differently, eyes wide with a mix of awe and regret, as if trying to reconcile the woman who quietly repaired radios with the soldier who'd once saved hundreds from being buried in Helmand. For a long moment, nothing broke the silence but the hum of machines and the whisper of the desert wind outside. And then slowly the atmosphere shifted. Shoulders dropped, jaws unclenched, and though nobody spoke, respect replaced ridicule in the air. Sarah Whitaker didn't need their applause. She didn't need their words. The salute from the SEAL captain had said enough for all of them. If this surprised you, hit like, and wait for the reveal in the next part. The salute ended, the silence stretched, and then life in the command post crept forward again. Maps were pulled closer, radios adjusted, reports scribbled down in hasty handwriting, but something had shifted in the air, something heavier than desert dust. Sarah Whitaker didn't linger in the weight of the moment. She didn't step forward to explain herself, didn't revel in the stunned expressions, or the captain's recognition. She simply turned back to her console, lowered her head, and continued adjusting the dial. The hum of the radio returned, steady and sharp, and she leaned into her work as though nothing at all had happened. It was the most ordinary thing she could have done, and that was what made it extraordinary. The same woman who'd once held the lifeline of 2 SEAL platoons in her hands went back to doing what nobody had respected her for hours earlier, repairing a radio. The screwdriver turned in her fingers, the small scar at her wrist catching the glow of the console light. Greatness doesn't always wear stripes. It doesn't always announce itself or demand recognition. Sometimes it sits in the corner of a hot tent, quiet and steady, waiting for the moment when it's needed most. Sarah had carried her truth in silence until the day it was forced into the open. And even then, when the curtain of ridicule fell away to reveal who she truly was, she chose humility over pride. That night, as the desert cooled and the sky burned with stars, the camp began to settle. Some soldiers gathered in the smoke pit, their conversations muted, uneasy. Others lay awake on their bunks, replaying the captain's words in their heads. And one Marine, the very one who'd once called her cable tech loud enough for the mess hall to hear, walked quietly through the communications tent. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He simply placed a steaming cup of coffee on the bench beside her tools and walked out. Sarah noticed it a few minutes later, lifting the mug in her hands, the bitter smell curling up through the night air. She didn't need to know who left it. The gesture said enough. Respect isn't given, it isn't demanded through rank or shouted over the noise. It's earned in silence, through actions that outlive the moment, revealed only when the truth can't be ignored any longer. And that night at Bastion, the truth had spoken loud enough that nobody could ever mock her again. Some stories are loud, firefights, medals, speeches, but others are quiet, carried by the professionals who never ask for recognition, who sit in the corner until the world needs them most. Sarah Whitaker's story is one of those, a reminder that courage doesn't always look like the biggest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the steady hands on a radio, the silence that holds everything together when chaos strikes. If this moved you, salute in the comments, and share this with someone who doubts the quiet ones. They might be carrying the heaviest load. Next time you'll hear about a medic who broke every rule to bring his brothers home alive. Guess where it happened?